Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Nice to get together again, as always, on our Tuesday morning slot. So we've been learning Sefer Bereshis now for quite a while. So I've got today and next Tuesday, Bez Hashem, two shiurim before I hand over to somebody else and take just a mini break, just for 2 years. You know, it's a segula for Arichus Yomim for everybody in the Shia. But there's just a 2-year break, and in 2 years we'll all be, Baruch Hashem, all healthy and well and a little bit older and wiser, and we'll pick up where we left off, please God, in a couple of years' time. That is the current, that's the plan. So I was thinking of doing something maybe a little bit different today, instead of continuing with Bereshis, even though the Bereshis topics are absolutely wonderful, profound ideas. But I've recently been working quite a bit on the life and the times of Rav Kook and the early part of the 20th century in Israel. How Judaism, Jewish life came to be built up in Israel in the early, the first half of the 20th century. And I say came to be built up because, in actual fact, in Israel, prior to, say, the year 1900, there was very, very small, minuscule, almost little pockets of Orthodox Judaism in Israel. There was in Yerushalayim, the old Yishuv, what became later on the Badatz. There was the old Yishuv of Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. There was also in Tzfat and in Tiberia. There were some small pockets. But actually, by and large, the Aliyah that came out of Europe, they were by and large not Dati. By and large, they were not observant Jews. On the contrary, most of the Jews that came over say that what is generally referred to as the first Aliyah, people who came in after 1881, after the great pogroms in Russia. Most of the people who left Central Europe and Russia went to America. Some of them came to Israel, but they were predominantly not religious people. But some of them were. But they established already the beginnings of Zichron Yaakov and Petach Tikva and Nes Tziona. These were the Yishuvim that they started. But there wasn't really yet any Jewish rabbinic infrastructure in Israel, or it was very, very small. Wasn't yet a national movement of any sort. And then there was the second Aliyah, which started pretty much in 1904, following the Kishinev pogrom, which got very, very wide publicity. Kishinev was a little town outside of Odessa, and there was a pogrom there in 1904, which was very widely reported and which scared the life out of Jews in Russia, Poland, and Central Europe at the time. And that created a second wave, what was called the second Aliyah. And these people who came in were even more, I would say, by and large, I'm overgeneralizing a bit, but they were even more anti-religious, because they had been educated into communism and into extreme socialism and the atheism of Marxism, all these isms, right, which have fallen by the wayside pretty much nowadays. At that time, it's hard for us to believe that 120, Rabbi Beryl Wine speaks about it occasionally, right? How hard it is for us to believe today how millions of Jews were swept up into the dream of communism and extreme socialism and Marxism in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And of course, with it came an extreme atheism. Part of Marxism was that to get rid of any religious, what they call religious myths and religious behavior and religious identity, all that was considered to be a problem. So when they came to Israel and started making yeshuvim and kibbutzim in the early 1900s, these were by and large non-observant and often much more than that, often anti-religious centers of Hashaber Tzair and Mapai and Mapam, and these organizations, political organizations. We're talking about all, of course, long before Medinat Yisrael. We're talking about just the foundations of society here in Israel. It's a I find it a very fascinating period of history. What I want to show you today is to have a brief look at 4 people. There were 4, it's very fascinating to see how there were 4 people who were just Talmidei Chachamim, and who all really sat together in a Beis HaMedrash in Volozhin. Volozhin was considered in Lithuania to be the mother of all yeshivas. Out of Volozhin, was the Talmidim of Volozhin that created Ponovich and Mir and Slobodka, and all these other yeshivas were spin-offs from the Volozhin yeshiva. And the Volozhin yeshiva at that time was run by the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, was one of the Rosh Yeshivas. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik was another one of the Rosh Yeshivas there. And they were producing great Talmidei Chachamim and great scholars, right? But something interesting happened. And that's why I find this very fascinating. Something interesting happened at the turn of the 20th century. Now, we're talking about that late 1800s and the early 1900s. And as a result of that, 4 people came on Aliyah. And it's a very interesting story about how really a small group of individuals can really create a complete almost revolution or a completely new reality just between them. A small group of determined individuals, what they can achieve together is amazing. So let's have a look for a minute. I should have a text here somewhere, share screen. Okay, can you see the screen? See the text? Yes? So this is 20th century Aliyah from Volozhin, 4 builders of Torah in Israel. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that if it wasn't for these 4 people, Israel would be a totally secular state today, and there wouldn't be any Jewish life here. That's what I mean. That sounds pretty dramatic, but we take it for granted, right? That in Israel today, of course, we all know that the founders politically and militarily of Israel were predominantly non-religious and anti-religious people. But who built up the Torah? And what's interesting here is to see there were 4 people who came in. But I've written here, before we even look at the 4 people, there were already the ideological foundations of this movement was already created by someone whose name is not so well known and his writings are not so well known. Somebody called Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Anyone ever heard of Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer? Dina, you've heard of Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer? Yes, you heard of him. Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, not very well-known person. And even his writings, his main publication, as I've written here, was Drishat Tzion. But he's writing in the early part of the 1800s. He's writing 1830, 1840, 1850. He's writing already then at a time when what came to be known as the Zionist movement didn't exist yet, and Herzl hadn't been born yet, and the whole movement to create a state of Israel hadn't got off the ground yet. But he wrote a book, and it's interesting how one man and one book and the force of the intellect and the learning of one individual can actually shift the focus of the whole people. And this in itself is a very fascinating study. So I've written here, let's read this. So Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, you can see, was still born at the end of the 18th century. But he was himself a teacher and a Rav, but his main power lay in the book that he wrote. He wrote a book called Drishat Tzion. And I've written here was a book of coherent ideology with Talmudic sources for the need to emigrate to the land of Israel and settle there. And I put here in heavy type the main chiddush of his book. The main chiddush of his book was the move from passive to active messianism. And I'd like to talk about that just for a few minutes, because that is the key to what motivated the four individuals that we're going to be looking at now for a minute. What does it mean, passive and active messianism? And why is it important to understand this? Is because even to this day, there are still people, and this issue is still an issue within Klal Yisrael, within the Orthodox Jewish movement worldwide. What does it mean, active and passive messianism? So the idea of messianism, of course, is a belief in Mashiach. Messianism means Mashiach. And it's a belief that the Torah tells us that there will come a Mashiach, a redemption of this world. When the Rambam 850 years ago came to write his 13 principles of Yisodei Hadat, of principles of faith, that what we call the Ani Ma'amin principles. So one of them is Ani Ma'amin b'Vias HaMashiach. In other words, the idea that we are waiting eagerly for the redemption of the Jewish people at a messianic period, this is hardwired into every time we bench, right? Every time we daven Shemana Esrei, Tzemach Tov in Avdecha Meheira Tatzmiach, every tefillah that we say and everything that we do contains within it the principle of our active, our sort of waiting for the Mashiach. But here comes the important question. Our relationship to Mashiach, our relationship to this redemption, is it something we are passively waiting for? And it's something which will be completely decided by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He will decide at the right moment to bring the Mashiach, right? And we actually have no hand at all in making that happen. Or should we engage in active messianism? In other words, are there things we can do which could, so to speak, oil the wheels? We could speed up the process to bring the Mashiach sooner. This is not a simple question. Theologically, and even in terms of learning the texts of Mashiach. Don't forget, the texts of Mashiach are mainly Yeshaya and Zechariah from the Tanakh and Midrashei Chazal. We don't have exact definitions of it. Are we meant to sit passively and wait for a miraculous revelation from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which will bring the Geula, that one day the world is as we know it, and 5 minutes later there is a flash bang, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings the Geula, and it's nothing to do with us at all. That is one view. That is called passive messianism. That our belief in emunah, our emunah in Mashiach is indeed a very strong emunah, but it doesn't have any practical consequences. Right? Somebody mentioned, in the footnote here, somebody speaks about in Mitzrayim. Now that's an interesting question because we're reading now the Parshias of Shmos Va'era Bo B'Shalach of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and it's interesting. In actual fact, in Mitzrayim itself, it's an interesting question when you're reading the story. Was Yetzias Mitzrayim something which Klal Yisrael, did they have to do anything in order to spark off the Geula, or were they carried along with it as passive passengers? What do you think? Anybody got any thoughts on the subject? Was it active or was it passive? Yes, Dina, what do you want to say?
I'm saying that they had to start. They had to take the lamb and they had to tie it up for 3 days. They had to shecht it and put the blood on the door. They had to do an action, and from that was built the Geula. We always,
right.
We always have to do a little action, and then Hashem does the rest with anything.
Right. In other words, what was required of them were certain mitzvahs, particularly the blood on the doorpost and the Korban Pesach, and as a response to that, the Yetzias Mitzrayim took place. But if we put that under the microscope for a minute, Dina, we look at this a bit more closely, we find that actually all that was required of Klal Yisrael were, as we just now said, to do mitzvahs, to do the Kadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to do mitzvahs. We did mitzvahs, but they weren't required to engage in any, if you like, revolution against Paro. You could have had a different story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. You could have had Moshe Rabbeinu motivating the Jewish people to rise up in rebellion against their masters and to forcibly break out of Mitzrayim and make a revolution, a rebellion, like the Russian Revolution. It could have happened differently, but it didn't happen like that. On the contrary, what seems to happen from the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is that the Jewish people, in a certain sense, are very reluctant to go along with Yetzias Mitzrayim. But Oshomu El Moshe, Mikotze Ruach, Me'avodah Zara, Me'avodah Kosher, they couldn't even listen. They couldn't, when Moshe Rabbeinu said, come, let's go, it's time for us to go. They said, what are you talking about? Let's go. We're busy, we're working, we're slaves, there's no way out of here. And it's interesting to see, this week is Parshas Boy, but if you come to Parshas B'Shalach, think about it for a second. The Pasuk says, Vahi B'Shalach Paro et Sa'om. If you think about that pasuk just for a minute, it sounds a bit strange. Why do we describe Yetzias Mitzrayim as Paro expelling the Jewish people from his country? Why doesn't the pasuk say a bit more like David HaMelech says in Hallel? The pasuk should have said, "B'tzeis Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, Beis Yaakov me'am lo'ez, Hosei Yehuda v'Kodsho." Moshe Rabbeinu in Hallel has got a much more upbeat, positive description of these events, where clearly the Jewish people were celebrating and were motivated and were involved in Yetzias Mitzrayim with a full heart. B'Shalach Paro Sa'om sounds like the Paro was throwing them out, whether they wanted to go or not. So these are very interesting topics which I could spend the rest of the shiur on, but I'm not going to. That's a subject for another shiur. But the interesting part is that when it comes to the Geula of Moshiach, throughout the last 2,000 years, until Kalisha wrote his book, Drishat Tzion, the assumption in Orthodox Jewish life was that Mashiach will appear miraculously. He will redeem us miraculously. He will transport us to Israel miraculously and will build the Beis HaMikdash miraculously. And there's nothing we can do of any of these activities which will be in any way successful or useful to bring the Geula. That was passive massive. We wait for it to happen to us. He put together a book, Drishat Tzion, where he said that times have changed. We are now in a position to change gear and to move into active messianism. And the first stage of active messianism is, wherever possible, to move to the land of Israel. But that's not all of it. It's not just aliyah for the sake of geographical relocation. To move to the state of Israel and build up Torah and mitzvahs in the land of Israel. To build in the land of Israel centers of Torah and mitzvahs. That's what's going to be important. If we do that, then we are preparing the ground for Mashiach. And this is a very, very interesting thesis, which sent real ripple effects throughout the rabbinic Jewish world at the time. And in some people, it aroused a tremendous pushback and a rejection, and that he's an apikoros, and that he's a heretic and an activist, and he wants to do things which are unacceptable. That was some reactions. And others said, wait a minute, this sounds like a definite possibility. Bear in mind that the Jewish people in Europe, we're talking about European Jewry at the moment, the Jewish people in Europe had for many centuries been completely, if you like, paralyzed by their non-Jewish host countries. They had no civil rights, they had no power, they had no wealth, they had no organizational abilities. They were simply tolerated and often persecuted, and blood libels and and beaten, and they felt very impotent. Suddenly, in the second part of the 1800s, the Jews started feeling a bit more powerful. Yes, you wanted to add something, Dina? You wanted to say something? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just was wondering, like, why then? But you're saying the late 1800s is probably because of emancipation, that they felt they had strength.
Emancipation.
Why there were always anti-Semitism and pogroms and
yes, there was a lot of anti-Semitism and pogroms, but suddenly emancipation gave the Jewish people in Europe the message, guess what? You can go to university, you can become a professional, you can own property, you can have a bank account, you can have a passport, you're a citizen. It gave them, and suddenly they felt, wait a minute, we are back in the driving seat. If we're in the driving seat, let's use it in order to return to the land of Israel, build up Torah there, and by doing so, we can create the building blocks for eventually Mashiach. Are you following what's going on? The line of thinking here is very, very fascinating. Something which had always simply been a dream, right? And it's often referred to as a dream, right? In the Shir HaMalas, we say always before benching, Shir HaMalas, B'shuv Hashem Shivas Tzion, Hayinu Kecholmim. Hayinu Kecholmim. It's a dream. It's just a dream. And that dream had really been a wonderful dream, and it still remains to this day a dream. But sometimes circumstances change, said Rabbi Kalisha, right? So
Rabbi Kimchi, you're frozen. Rabbi Kimchi, you're frozen. Check your internet.
Call him to let him know he can't hear you on the computer if he's frozen.
He's gone. Hi, Rabbi Kimchi, you know you froze and now you're gone. Okay. Maybe you should try your cell phone. Maybe you should try your cell phone. Okay. Okay, sure. Thank you. Okay, he said his Wi-Fi went down. He's gonna just hang on for a few minutes and he'll try it again, or he'll go on his cell phone. You all heard me, right? Okay, good.
Yes, we heard you.
Thank you, Michael.
Hello, everybody.
מה ההבדל במחיר? אבל תראה,
My apologies. Something went down with my Wi-Fi. I am back, courtesy of my neighbor's Wi-Fi. Always good to have a neighbor with a strong Wi-Fi signal. Definitely, always a very useful thing to have. But as a fallback situation for when your Wi-Fi goes down. But so here we are, courtesy of the neighbor. I'll give him a yasher koach afterwards. I'll send him a text. So let's continue a little bit because there's some interesting material here which is worth knowing about. So Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. So he's, as I say, he's an important man in Central Europe, in the rabbinic world in the mid-1800s, and he has decided that the time has come to make use of the newly discovered abilities of the Jews of Europe to turn a passive attitude into an active attitude. And let's try and see whether we can't lay the foundations for the Messianic period. Maybe we can lay the foundations by going back to Israel, and not just going to Israel, but establishing Torah and mitzvahs in Israel. Right? In fact, there's one very interesting chapter in his book where he speaks about a letter that he wrote to Baron Rothschild. So he speaks to Baron Rothschild, who was the most massively wealthy Jew on planet Earth in the mid-1800s, who had phenomenal amounts of money. And he says, look, I've got a good idea for you. Why don't you don't forget at that time, Israel was owned by the Ottoman Empire, was part of the Ottoman Empire. And that was Turkey. Speak to the Sultan, the head of the Ottoman Empire, and make him an offer. Buy that piece of land. Make him an offer. You'll give him an enormous sum of money and make a real estate deal with him that you'll buy Israel from him for the Jewish people. Now, this was, of course, an outrageous idea to sort of change political realities simply by a real estate purchase. But it gives you an idea of the state of mind of Kalischer and others like him at the time, who suddenly realized, wait a minute, we are Jews now, we have got money, we've got influence, we can change political realities. Maybe we can simply use commercial transactions to change political realities and bring Israel back into Jewish hands simply by using Rothschild's millions. Now, Rothschild did not, of course, do what he was asked, but there's no question that somewhere along the line, these ideas of Kalischer did filter through. And as you all know, most of the settlements in Israel, which were founded in the 1880s, most of the settlements, places like the Zichron Yaakov and Rosh Pinah and similar settlements were in fact established with Rothschild money. Rothschild didn't buy the whole country, but he certainly started investing heavily in the land of Israel and laying the foundations for vineyards and wine manufacture and different settlements in the land of Israel. And that was all happened in the 1880s. And there's no question that the writings of Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer really pressed a few buttons in the mind of Rothschild and other Jewish activists at the time, Moses Montefiore. Others suddenly started visiting Israel, investing in Palestine, and taking an active role in restoring Israel into Jewish hands. I find this a very, very fascinating turning point in the life of the land of Israel. And of course, later on, secular Zionism got into the driving seat, and through Herzl and the Zionist Congress, etc., started laying the foundations for secular Zionism. But it's important to realize that alongside the development of secular Zionism in the late 1800s, there was a very strong sort of grassroots movement of religious Zionism alongside of it, mainly based on the writings of Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Now let's go back to the text that I wanted to show you. Okay, bear with me for 1 second. Should have this text here somewhere. Okay, this will take 1 moment. And right, got it. Okay, so Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, as you can see, he lives through, he never makes it to the 20th century. His dates, you can see his dates here, are from 1794 to 1874. But he laid the foundations, and then what happens is, on the basis of his ideas, there was a movement started, which was called Nes Tziyona. Right? Nes Tziyona, which comes from a pasuk in the Tanakh. So Nes Tziyona is a movement which is initiated in the Volozhin Yeshiva. We're talking about, can you see this? This is Nes Tziyona movement initiated in the Volozhin Yeshiva in 1885 to build rabbinic leadership, to spread the ideology of the return to the land of Israel, became part of the Chovevei Tzion movement. So these are words that you've probably heard of. They're names of streets in Israel, and Chovevei Tzion and Nes Tziyona, names of places. But all these were very important turning points in the ideology of rabbinic leadership in the late 19th century. So here you have, if you want to have a rather oversimplified line of cause and effect, it starts with the Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer sort of in the early 1830s, 1840s, and then in the 1880s it becomes Nes Tziyona, and now we're going to have a look at 4 people. There were 4 people who really laid the foundations of Orthodox rabbinic life in Israel as we know it today. And of course, when I say 4, I don't mean there were only 4. There were, of course, several others as well. But these are the 4 I want to focus on for the time being, because I think they played an important role. The first one is somebody called Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. I don't know if anybody's heard of Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. He didn't become such a famous leader, but behind the scenes, he was an extremely important figure. You can see here as a founder and president of the Mizrahi movement of religious Zionism, right? He published a book called Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, and he combined Torah with working the land. He was actually a colleague of, and he was willing to interact with Theodor Herzl. Most of the Orthodox rabbis shunned Theodor Herzl because, of course, Theodor Herzl was a completely assimilated, non-observant, and ignorant Jew. As a Jew, he knew nothing about Torah and mitzvahs. He knew nothing about Shabbos and Kashrus, and he knew nothing about that at all. He was, of course, Theodor Herzl, the founder of secular Zionism, but he saw secular Zionism as a solution simply for anti-Semitism. He originally thought that the solution to anti-Semitism was assimilation. And for the first half of his life, first 20 years of his life, he was very much into assimilation. Let's try and forget our Jewish identity, assimilate smoothly into European Jewry, and that will solve the problems of anti-Semitism. He then saw famously at the Dreyfus trial, he saw that even in France, where assimilation was the rule, nevertheless, assimilation was anti-Semitism was very powerful. So he decided assimilation is not the answer to anti-Semitism. The answer to anti-Semitism has to be, we have to have our own state. So that was Theodor Herzl, but it had nothing to do with Mashiach, with Torah, with mitzvahs, with Kedusha, with the biblical tradition, nothing to do with that at all. But Rabbi Yitzhak Yaakov Reinus came on board and he said to Herzl, you know what? I want to be your partner. I want to found something called the Mizrahi Party. Mizrahi Party will work with you, and we will get the message of Zionism out to religious Jews in order that religious Jews should join your movement of returning to the land of Israel and building up the land of Israel physically, militarily, economically, but also religiously. So Yitzhak Yaakov Reinus was a very influential person behind the scenes. He wasn't really a leader from the front, but he was a scholar, and behind the scenes with Herzl, he created what came to be known as the Mizrahi Party, which was the beginning of religious Zionism. And again, it's worth mentioning that there were large sectors of the Orthodox world in Europe who were completely scandalized by this. They considered Reinus to be a real apikoros, that he was joining hands with Rishonim, and he was supporting something which was anti-religious and anti-Torah. And Reinus, for his part, incidentally, was, interestingly, he was very anti-messianic. In other words, in the writings of Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reinus, he wanted to build the Mizrahi Party on the basis that we want to return to Israel, not because we're bringing the Mashiach. He was a bit allergic to the idea of bringing the Mashiach. He said, of course, we believe in Mashiach, but that's not the reason we go back to Israel. We want to go back to Israel because it's the land of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's the land of the Tanakh. It's the land of Yerushalayim and Hebron and Tzfat. And we want to reconnect with our biblical origins, but don't talk to me about Mashiach. Are you following me? So really, the Mizrahi movement under the guidance of Rabbi Reinus really became a force of religious Zionism, encouraging many thousands of youth, Bnei Akiva youth, etc., to go on Hachshara and come to Israel, but not about Mashiach. It's not about the Geula, it's not about the redemption, it's about reclaiming our biblical lands. That's really what it was about. So this was Rabbi Reinus. I'm moving on a bit quickly because unfortunately we've lost a bit of time. Maybe next week I'll develop this a bit more. And here, the next person here on this list is probably the most famous for all of you as Harav Kook. Okay, so Harav Kook was, he came from Volozhin, right? What's interesting is that these people all really knew each other and they basically learned together. But he had, as I've written here, he had a vision of Atchalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemption. And Rav Kook's writings is full of Geula, right? And I've written here spiritual Torah revival of Jewish nationalism, totally inclusive of all. What do I mean totally inclusive of all? So this is actually a whole very interesting subject in the writings of Rav Kook. But Rav Kook, what does it mean totally inclusive of all? It means that he took the view that the non-religious Zionists who came to Israel and built completely secular villages and towns and yeshuvim, they built Degania and Kinneret and Hashomer Tza'ir, we're all still talking, of course, long before Medinat Yisrael was born. He said, it's a mistake for us to speak about them as Rishonim, as people who have abandoned Judaism. Look at them. Look what they're doing. They're building up the land of Israel. They're draining the swamps and planting the trees and building the roads and manning the guns and defending us from the enemy. They are our partners. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Rav Kook made himself very unpopular with his Haredi rabbinic colleagues. Don't forget, Rav Kook was a Haredi Litvish Talmud Chacham with a shtreimel. and with Yiddish speaking, and he brought with him the Torah from Lithuania and from Europe, and he was a Talmud Chacham of the greatest caliber. He was also a Kabbalist of the greatest caliber. But he came along and he said, we today, in order to build up Israel, we have to embrace the non-religious Zionists, because it's true they're not Shomer Shabbos, and it's true they don't eat kosher, and it's all very sad. And maybe, please God, we can be makarev them in some way or another. We can convince them to be more observant. But in the interim, they are our partners in building up the land of Israel, and we have to embrace them and work with them. And in fact, he used to speak a lot to the non-religious Zionist founders and settlers in the land of Israel, and he used to speak to them with warmth and with encouragement, and he used to validate. In fact, he annoyed them a little bit by saying, you think you've abandoned Torah and mitzvahs, but you haven't, because every day of your life you're doing a great mitzvah. And what is that? Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. You're building up the land of Israel. So you think you're not doing mitzvahs, but really you are. And they would turn around and say, no, don't tell us we're doing mitzvahs. We're here on a nationalist basis. And that was an interesting aspect of Rav Kook's life. But certainly what he wanted to do was to, in many ways, unite together, to build bridges between the secular Zionists and the religious communities of Israel. So Rabbi Reines had created the Mizrahi political party. Rav Kook was not interested in political parties. Rav Kook never joined the Mizrahi political party. He didn't want to get involved in any political parties. He didn't want to get involved in any political parties at all. He wanted just to live in Israel and teach Torah and to be Makarev people and to build yeshivas and build up a Jewish identity in the land of Israel. But he was very positive. I'll give you an interesting example. Rav Kook arrived in Israel, came on Aliyah in 1904. Within a few months of his arriving in Israel, Theodor Herzl died suddenly at the age of 44. Suddenly, Theodor Herzl died. And the question was, Theodor Herzl had been, of course, the figurehead of the motivating the whole secular Zionist enterprise, and now he's died. Is it appropriate for an Orthodox rabbi to give a hesped on someone like Theodor Herzl? Because the vast majority of Orthodox Rabbonim took the view, this man was an assimilated Jew. He had no connection to Shabbos and Kashrus and learning Torah and teaching Torah. He had no connection to the Jewish world that we are familiar with. And therefore, as far as we are concerned, he's a Rasha, he's a bad person. They were not willing to make a hesped about Theodor Herzl. However, Rav Kook famously stood up and he gave a public hesped on Theodor Herzl in 1904. And this hesped is a very interesting document, interesting to read. You can read it. It's in his collected writings. What did he say to commemorate the death of Theodor Herzl? And it was very fascinating because what he said was that the movement founded by Theodor Herzl indeed is not based on Torah and mitzvahs. It's not based on Mashiach, and it's not based on any Torah values at all, but they are our partners in building up the land of Israel. We have to work together. And he even invoked a very interesting theme, which is a subject for a whole separate shir. The writings of the Nevi'im and Yeshaya and Zechariah and others, when they speak about Mashiach, they speak about Mashiach ben David, Mashiach coming from the dynasty of David HaMelech, right? And that is, we daven every day, es tzemach David avdecha me'era tatzmiach. In the Tanakh, the only reference to the Mashiach, the ultimate redemption, is connected to Ben David, right? As tzemach David avdecha. However, in the Gemara, there is a concept of two Mashiachs. There's first comes Mashiach ben Yosef, and then comes Mashiach ben David. And what does Mashiach ben Yosef do? Mashiach ben Yosef is a man who lays the practical, political, military infrastructure, creates that in order that Mashiach ben David can come afterwards and create a spiritual redemption. So there are two levels of redemption, says Rav Kook. And this is a real masterful thesis of his that he speaks about at the hesped of Theodor Herzl. He says Theodor Herzl wasn't building up the neshama of Klal Yisrael, but he was building the guf of Klal Yisrael. Just like a human being has a body and a soul, the Jewish people also have a body and a soul. What's the body of the Jewish people? The body of the Jewish people is that the land of Israel is inhabited and that it has trees and it has roads and it has a military and it has an economy and the swamps are drained and that there's a kupat cholim, all the things that the secular Zionists built up. He said this is not irrelevant to us. This is the body of Klal Yisrael, which is the job of Mashiach ben Yosef. And he came very close. He didn't quite say it explicitly, because to say it explicitly would have been a bit blasphemous, I think, to say that Theodor Herzl himself was Mashiach ben Yosef. He doesn't quite say that, but he says Theodor Herzl certainly played a role in the era of Mashiach ben Yosef. Right? This is this was a bombshell in Israel at the time in 1904 when he said that the Yishuv of Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Shmuel Salanta and all the leaders of the Haredi Yishuv in Israel, they were scandalized by Rav Kook's statement. How could he possibly speak positively about an assimilated Jew who was anti-religious? And Rav Kook took the view that no, we have to include them all together and we have to build bridges between the Orthodox and the secular. And Rav Kook became really a model of that. He himself, of course, was an extremely particular Orthodox Jew. He used to go and visit the non-Orthodox Yeshuvim in the north of the country. And there are stories written, in fact, there are stories written about this, about the trips that he made. He used to go to visit certain secular kibbutzim, like Degania and Kinneret and these places in the Galil. And he used to come in there and sit and talk to them, and he wouldn't eat anything, of course, because it was all treif. He wouldn't eat anything, have a glass of water, he wouldn't eat anything. But he would sing with them and dance with them and schmooze to them and tell them that they're doing a fantastic job and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is happy with them. And even though they were eating treifus on Yom Kippur, he told them they're playing a vital role in building up the infrastructure of Klal Yisrael going forward, the return to Eretz Yisrael. And that Rav Kook had an enormous impact on the spiritual infrastructure of the land of Israel. At the same time, of course, he created the whole real, what we call today, the Dati Le'umi identity in Israel, was created largely by Rav Kook, the Talmidim of Rav Kook, the writings of Rav Kook. He really single-handedly laid the foundations for this, for what we see today. The whole what's called the Hesder Yeshivas, the Yeshivot B'nai Akiva. And if you recently, Rav Chaim Druckmann passed away at a ripe old age in his 90s. Rav Chaim Druckmann passed away. Excuse me one second. What are you looking for? Rav Chaim Druckmann passed away. Rav Chaim Druckmann was, in fact, the head of the Yeshivot B'nai Akiva, and he was a Talmid of the son of Rav Kook, and the son of Rav Kook, who published a lot of the writings of Rav Kook, came through his one and only son, and Rav Druckmann was a Talmid of his, and he influenced thousands of young people. So what you have here is the Israel that we are familiar with today, right? The foundations were laid by a very small handful of very dedicated people who came to Israel in the early 1900s. And they laid the foundations of the Mizrahi Party, of Yeshivot Merkaz Harav, the Hesder system, the Dati Le'umi world. And by doing so, they really created a society of people who are Shomerei Mitzvahs and at the same time committed to building up the land of Israel economically, militarily, and politically. And all this really just came from a handful of people, and reading about them and seeing their impact, I think, is quite inspirational. Please God, next week, okay, we've come to the end of our time. Next week, please God, will be my final shiur in this series. And please God, to be resumed when I come back here in a couple of years' time. But as I said to Dina before, it could be even while I'm away in Australia, it could be we can do maybe a monthly shiur of some sort on Zoom, just to keep in touch and learn a bit together. But in the meantime, please God, we'll see each other next week at the same time. Nice to see you all today. I hope you enjoyed this